Hello everyone, welcome to the Style 3D Atelier tutorial. Today, I will explain the application of sewing tools. Sewing tool is used to assemble 2D patterns into 3D models. These patterns have already been stitched by sewing tools. After stitching together, you can press the spacebar to simulate and sew the clothing patterns together and fit them onto the avatar. Next, let's discuss the application of editing sewing. Firstly, the edit sewing. You can click on the icon to enter the edit sewing mode directly. You can also enter using the shortcut key B. In the edit sewing mode, you can see the relationship of the sewing lines. Click on the sewing line, and the property editing window on the right will display the information of that sewing line. You can also edit the sewing line, such as adjusting its length, position, etc. Next, let's continue to check the information on the right side of the property editing window. The first is the sewing type, which refers to the assembly state of the pattern. There are two types, custom angle and turned. Next, let's open other project to demonstrate the difference between them. These two patterns use different sewing types. The yellow pattern uses turned, while the blue pattern uses custom angle. We can simulate to see the sewing effect. You can see that the yellow pattern overlaps with the gray pattern. They have a hierarchical relationship. Turned are generally used for making double-layered clothing parts, such as caps, collars, etc. While the blue pattern is horizontally connected to the gray pattern, they are on the same plane. For the sewing lines in custom angle, we can use the sewing editing tool to modify the folding angle of the sewing line to achieve different pattern assembly effects. The sewing line types are the two mentioned above. After adding a sewing line, the default sewing type is custom angle with a fold angle of 180 degrees. We can adjust the sewing angle and strength to achieve different effects. When the folding angle is greater than 180 degrees, the joint is recessed. By adjusting the folding strength, the effect can be made more pronounced. The smaller the strength, the weaker the effect. You can adjust it according to the desired effect. When the folding angle of the sewing line is less than 180 degrees, the joint will be raised. Similarly, you can also adjust the folding strength of the sewing line to change the folding effect. Next, let's look at the elastic of the sewing line. By adjusting the elastic ratio and strength, you can achieve a pleated effect on the clothing. After sewing between patterns, a gray indentation will appear in the middle. If you don't want this gray seam effect, use the editing sewing to select that sewing line, and in the property editing window on the right, find the sewing normal map. Change the strength to 0. This will remove the seam indentation effect. We can also directly delete the normal map to achieve the same effect. After explaining the property editing window on the right, let's continue to look at other editing functions for sewing lines in sewing editing mode. First, click on the edit sewing. Select one of the sewing lines. Right-click after selecting the sewing line. You can see there are several functions here. The first is to delete the sewing line. You can delete the selected sewing line. You can also press the delete key directly after selecting it. The second is to reverse the sewing line direction with the shortcut key Ctrl+B. You can change the sewing direction of the selected sewing line. Note that if the sewing direction is wrong, the clothing will be distorted. The third function is to deactivate the sewing line. It can deactivate the simulation of the sewing line we have set up. This is convenient for us to troubleshoot cloth penetration and unstable simulation reasons. To reactivate, you can right-click and select Activate after reselecting the segment. The fourth function is to add a top stitching line. After selecting, you can quickly generate a top stitching line on this edge of the sewing. The last two functions are to add point on start and on end. We can use this function to determine the sewing position on the pattern. Adding points on end is the same. The top stitching editing function will be discussed here. Next, we will explain the method of adding sewing lines. The main methods for adding sewing lines are segment sewing and free sewing. The first one is line sewing with the shortcut key N. When the mouse moves to the clean edge of the pattern, that is, the edge of the pattern, it will automatically recognize the line segment between the 2 points. When sewing multiple line segments, it's easy for line sewing to misidentify positions. At this time, it's more convenient to use the free sewing tool. The free sewing tool can be directly selected, or you can enter with the shortcut key M. Free sewing allows you to freely choose the starting and ending points of the sewing line. Choose sewing on both sides separately. When we add a duplicate sewing line, it will give this prompt. When using the sewing tool, be sure to observe the direction of the sewing line in both the 2D and 3D windows. In the 2D window, you can clearly see if the direction of the sewing line arrow corresponds. Here, delete a section of the sewing line and demonstrate again. You can see that when adding a sewing line, both windows change synchronously. Correct sewing effect segments are all parallel. But if the sewing direction is wrong, it will present in this crossed form. Simulation is prone to errors. So during the sewing process, pay attention to the accuracy of the sewing direction. What I just explained was the sewing between single segments. Next, let's continue to explain the sewing of multiple segments. First, it's one segment to multiple segments. Taking the sewing of a sleeve as an example, we need to sew this segment of the sleeve to both the front and back pieces. To observe the sewing effect more clearly, I pulled the sleeve out a bit. First, select the free sewing tool. Click on the edge segment of the sleeve that needs to be sewn. Click Confirm. Then hold down the Shift key. And click on the other two segments separately. Release the Shift key to finish. Sewing is completed. Next, let's demonstrate the sewing of multiple segments to multiple segments. For multiple to multiple, hold down the Shift key before sewing. Click on the multiple segments you want to sew separately. After selecting one side, you can release the Shift key. Continue to hold down the Shift key, and select the segments on the other side. The above is the operation of free multi-segment sewing. Segment sewing is the same principle, and here's a simple demonstration. First, switch to segment sewing mode, and also hold down the Shift key. Click on the corresponding segments. Release the Shift key to finish selecting, then continue to click on the other side. This is the sewing of multiple segments. So that's all for our sewing tools. If you like this video, welcome to like and share the video, and leave a message in the comment area. See you in the next video.